100 days into the Trump presidency, and we see this. An average of all the different polls you've been seeing out there the last couple of days puts his approval rating at 43%. That's with 54% disapproving of his performance as president. Now, how does Trump stack up that number compared to other presidents at this same point, 100 days in? Well, you can see it's at the bottom. It's actually tied at the bottom with Donald Trump the last time around. That's right, 100 days into his first term, his approval rating, it was exactly where it is 100 days into his second term. So there's two ways to look at these numbers for Trump. Compared to all modern presidents, these are very low numbers 100 days in. But of course, for Trump himself, this is how it's been. This is par for the course, 43% then and 43% now. Take a look at, as well, the question among independent voters. Again, you see a 31% approval rating for Trump among independents. If you looked last November at the election, Trump did better among independents than 31%, but also low 30s. Again, that is consistent with what we saw for Trump during his first term as well when it came to his job approval among independents. Look at it more from an issue standpoint here, and you do see a bit of a division in terms of Trump's numbers. Look at this. It's inflation, it's tariffs. This is where he gets his lowest marks, under 40% approval in both of those areas here. A little bit stronger, almost 10 points stronger, in fact, for Trump when it comes to government spending, the work of DOJ, and, of course, border and immigration. This is where he gets his highest marks, basically as much approval as disapproval on those questions. So that's the difference from these numbers from last time around. Economy, questions about economy, pocketbook issues, that's where Trump did the best in his first term. It's now where he is doing worst in his second term. One other big difference between then and now with these numbers, it's the opposition party. Back during Trump's first term, the Democratic Party was more popular than the Republican Party. Now, however, take a look at this. It's the reverse. The Democrats, 40 favorable, 59 unfavorable. They're almost 20 points underwater. It's not that the Republicans are popular. These aren't great numbers, but it's more unpopular significantly for the Democrats than the Republicans. So from Trump's standpoint, from Republican standpoint, that may be one of the key things they're looking at with these numbers. They may think, hey, these Trump numbers are not that great, but these Democratic numbers have gotten worse than they were in the past. Maybe that creates an opportunity for Republicans, too. One way of looking at this in perspective, Kelly.
Hi there, and welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Ryan Nobles in Washington, where we begin with breaking news as stocks rose for a second straight day, with President Trump walking back his threat to fire Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell and the White House signaling de-escalation in its trade war with China. Stocks finished the day higher for the second day in a row. The Dow rose more than 400 points at one point. It was over 1,000 points. Over the last two trading sessions, the major indices are up roughly 3 to 5%. Now, the improvement in market vibes comes after President Trump publicly echoed private assurances made by his Treasury Secretary to Wall Street bankers that sky-high tariffs with China will have to come down. Here's the president yesterday afternoon and this morning signaling changes to the current 145% tariff on Chinese imports.
I'm not going to say, I'm going to play hardball with China. I'm going to play hardball with you, President Xi. No. We're going to be very nice. They're going to be very nice. And we'll see what happens. But ultimately, they have to make a deal. 145% is very high, and it won't be that high. It's not going to be that high. It'll come down substantially, but it won't be zero. It used to be zero. We were just destroyed. China was taking us for a ride, and just not going to happen. It's not going to happen. We're going to be very good to China. Every country wants to partake, even countries that have ripped us off for many, many years. China is an example. We're going to make a lot of money for our people. We'll be able to lower taxes substantially, and we're going to be proud of ourselves.
Now, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent told reporters today that neither China nor the U.S. believe that these tariffs are at sustainable levels. He's calling it the equivalent of a trade embargo that really doesn't suit anyone's interest. It comes amid escalating pressure, though, on the White House. Axios reports that American retail titans personally warned the president this week that his trade policies could soon disrupt supply chains, leading to higher prices and empty shelves. And we've also seen a constant drumbeat of warnings from investors worried about the president's impulses and his threats to fire Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell, who Trump himself appointed to the job. Less than a week ago, the president publicly said, quote, Powell's termination cannot come fast enough. On Monday, he called Powell a, quote, major loser, comments which roiled the market. But yesterday, the president essentially rescinded those threats.
I have no intention of firing him. I would like to see him be a little more active in terms of his idea to lower interest rates. This is a perfect time to lower interest rates. If he doesn't, is it the end? No, it's not. But it would be good timing. It could have taken place earlier. But no, I have no intention to fire him.
Now, the Wall Street Journal reports that the Treasury Secretary and the Commerce Secretary were instrumental in getting Trump to drop his threats against Powell, warning him that trying to oust the head of the independent central bank would trigger legal challenges and chaos in the markets. Of course, all of the headlines right now about the president's softening on the Fed and China are just that. They're just headlines right now. And in this political environment, we never know what could happen next. Joining me now is NBC News senior White House correspondent Gabe Gutierrez, NBC News business and data correspondent Brian Chung, and Jason Furman. He was the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors in the Obama White House. He's now a professor at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. So, Gabe, let's start with you. The Trump we've heard in the last 24 hours seems to be a lot different than the Trump we heard earlier this month. What went into this change in posture? Was he spooked by the markets and the economic developments?
Hey there, Ryan. Well, certainly a softening of tone from the president, as you just laid out. Look, there was a confluence of factors here that really have been building over the last several days. You talked about the markets. Look, it was just a couple of days ago that we were getting that headline that the markets were heading towards their worst April since the Great Depression. Now, add that to the fact that there were several CEOs from major retailers here on Monday, from Walmart, Target, Home Depot. Lowe's was supposed to come here, but we understand that they didn't. Either way, they had a conversation with the president here at the White House about trade, about tariffs, and that all led up to yesterday when in that Oval Office meeting with reporters, the president dramatically shifted his tone, not just about tariffs on China, but also about potentially firing Jerome Powell, who's just played. He said that he wouldn't do it. So it was several things leading up to this. Certainly a lot of people in his ear, including potentially the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, and his Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick, may have led to that softening of the tone there.
And there does appear to be a bit of confusion, Gabe, about the talks with China right now. I mean, what is the latest there with Chinese tariffs? Are the two sides actually engaging at all? Trump says the talks are active. Do we even know what level these talks are taking place at?
Well, that appears to be a moving target, Ryan. The president earlier today did say that active talks were underway, but around that same time this morning, the Treasury Secretary was speaking with reporters, and he said that the talks hadn't actually started yet. And then a senior administration official telling NBC News that the talks were indeed underway, but that they were happening at a lower level, than a sub-cabinet level. So we still don't know exactly what is happening here with regards to those talks. But I want to play a little bit of what the president told reporters earlier today here at the White House. Listen.
Can you clarify, Mr. President, on China?
Yeah,
are you thinking about lowering their tariffs?
Fair deal with China. It's going to be fair.
Are you talking to them actively now?
Actively. Everything's active. Everybody wants to be a part of what we're doing.
So again, the president there saying that active negotiations were underway. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt this afternoon saying that they were in discussions with many countries right now. But as it stands now, Ryan, we don't have any clarity on exactly what level these talks with China are supposedly happening.
And another issue we're looking to get clarity on is the future of Elon Musk. He says he's scaling back his time with Doge. What could that mean?
Well, several things there. So, yes, yesterday during an earnings call, Elon Musk, after profits were down 71% of Tesla, he did say that he would scale back his time here at the White House with Doge, saying that his work with Doge had largely taken place, that he had established this Department of Government Efficiency, and they would probably only work here in the government one or 2 days a week if the president would have him. But the fact is, Ryan, that Elon Musk has been facing increasing pressure from the financial world to pay more attention to Tesla, given the fact that his political work has led to that steep drop in stock price, also vandalism against Tesla dealerships as well. And the Trump White House had been saying that he was going to work here until his end of his time as a special government employee, which we believe to be in late May. But he has lost some influence, at least in the last couple of weeks, because remember, it was his pick for acting IRS commissioner that was appointed. Then it was that the commissioner was dismissed just a few days later at the urging of the Treasury Secretary, Ryan.
Okay, Gabe, thank you for starting us off from the North Lawn. Let's go now to Brian Chung. Another roller coaster day, Brian. Break down what we saw on Wall Street. Does it appear that the markets like what they heard from the White House this week?
Yeah, well, it appears that they did, because the markets had a pretty nice close, in the green. They did start the morning looking like they would be even higher in terms of those gains. Now it seems like maybe investors are a little bit sobering up to the idea that maybe those conversations and the temperature of those conversations with China aren't as substantive as we thought, given that based off of what Gabe was just talking about, we don't know if those conversations are really, in progress right now. But nonetheless, this does underscore that the volatility is still present there in the markets. I mean, I think if you talk about the Overton window shifting, it seems like we are now at the stage of this trade conversation where it seems like markets are going to be very much at the whim of what those negotiations or communications between the United States and China look like. This is very similar, I want to point out, to the 2018-2019 trade war that the Trump administration in its first iteration went about with China, where there were a lot of attention was paid to Robert Lighthizer, the then U.S. trade representative, and whether or not he was having discussions with China. You saw market swings very similarly like we're seeing now. That might be the story in the months to come, just the nature and whether or not those discussions are happening, Ryan.
And I wonder if investors' habits are changing as a result of this kind of unprecedented way that Donald Trump is kind of attacking the economy. I want to put up a line from Bloomberg's Matt Levine. He said that previous Treasury secretaries would have met with investors and said things like, well, the world's two largest economies will have to find a way to work together. And investors would have said, sure, of course. And it wouldn't have been particularly market moving. But now when the Treasury secretary tells you that, your reaction is, oh, wow, that's a drastic policy shift from yesterday. And then you rush to buy stocks. Does it seem as though investors are reacting to every little thing that's happening that comes out of this administration? Because they can't possibly be confident that this is the end of the de-escalation, right? Is it about short-term games right now? How's the market overall reacting to this?
Yeah, I mean, Matt Levine, great read. I do want to point out that, when it comes to that kind of perspective, that's probably not a good thing for markets, because as an investor, you want certainty in the types of investments that you're making. Generally, when you buy a stock, you are hoping that you're going to get capital accumulation, or that stock price will go up based off of future cash flows. But you don't know what the future cash flows are going to be if you don't even know what the tariff rate is going to be come tomorrow or come an hour from now. So I think it speaks to the uncertainty that's underlying markets. But I think the bigger question is really, it's not about the S&P 500 or the Dow that is concerning a lot of economists and financial types. It's really what's happening in bond markets, which did apparently convince the president to scale back those tariffs on all those countries around the world.
Yeah. Okay. Brian Chung, thank you for that. Let's go now to Jason Furman to get his take on all of this. First, Jason, I want to start with your reaction to what you've seen out of the Trump administration in the last 24 hours. To you, does this look like they're caving, or is it really just a short-term effort to juice the market?
Look, they have done a lot of damage through their policies on trade and their rhetoric on the Fed. And it's good that they've undone a fraction of that damage, but it's only a fraction of that damage. Moreover, I am worried. The China talks are going to be harder than they think. Maybe we're going to settle for a token concession, call it off. That would be fine. But if we want something big and meaningful, we haven't set it up in the right way to achieve that.
What do you think it was that led to Donald Trump walking this back a little bit? Is it the bond market that he's worried about? Is he worried about empty store shelves, the alarming message he got from these big box retailers? What do you think was kind of the final straw for him?
Yeah, I don't know what the final straw was. 2 weeks ago, it was the bond market. Maybe this time it was the retailers. 1 week it's Jamie Dimon. Next week it's something else. It's good to know that he is reactive and responsive to these pressures. But that's a reminder that everything coming out of these policies is pretty much bad, especially the yelling at the Fed. Nothing good comes out of that for anyone. And so there's just everyone has a motive to try to talk him out of it. And sometimes he listens, sometimes he doesn't.
It's interesting you bring up Powell. Do you think that the assurances he's given around Powell's job is enough? Or is there always the concern that he could turn back on it again and be angry with Powell again and call for his removal?
Look, I think the words he used was for now. So I'm not sure. But, Powell's term ends in May of next year. I'd love to see him reappointed. Sadly, that's not going to happen. And it is obviously a legitimate choice for the president to choose and nominate someone else and see them through the Senate. So I hope his people can convince him, just wait a year and you can solve this so-called problem.
And finally, and you've kind of already alluded to this, but given all the uncertainty and Trump's mercurial nature, what if he does end up getting some sort of concessions from his trading partners? Will those disruptions be worth it? Is there a big enough win to go through all the pain that we've seen in the economy over the past couple of months?
No. Most of these countries have pretty minimal barriers to American exports. So Vietnam could lower its tariffs all the way to zero, and it would help our economy by 0.0001% or something like that. So causing known certain damage for concessions that would help our exports a tiny bit to a few countries around the world, there would have been a much easier way to get to that outcome. It's just not worth this pain.
Okay. And a lot of uncertainty still ahead as we continue to go through this. Jason Furman, thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Kristen Welker in Washington, where we're closing in on the 100-day mark of the Trump presidency, with new polling showing Americans have grown dissatisfied with the president's economic agenda as the threat of market turmoil and economic uncertainty risks overshadowing the administration's other priorities. Brand new numbers from our NBC News Stay Tuned poll show the president 20 points underwater on the issue that was core to his election success, inflation and the cost of living, with 60% of Americans disapproving of his handling of that issue. That published dissatisfaction, coupled with worries from big business and the markets, appear to be weighing on the White House as it has signaled a de-escalation with China, with the president softening his tone on the sky-high 145% tariff he placed on Chinese imports, and saying the Fed Chair Jerome Powell's job is safe. In the Oval Office today, meeting with Norway's Prime Minister, President Trump made some ambiguous remarks on the process of potential trade deals and attacked his predecessor.
We just have a great country. We have a very strong country, and we have every other country. I can't think of one country that doesn't want to negotiate a deal. And they either negotiate a deal or we set a deal that we think is fair. We are going to, at some point, just set prices for deals. Some will be tariffed. Some treated us very unfairly. They'll be tariffed higher than others. But we've been ripped off for many, many years. The United States has been ripped off like no country probably in the history of the world. I don't blame those countries. I blame the people that sat at that beautiful desk right behind you, because those people didn't do the job for this country.
The numbers from our newest poll come amid other warning signs for the administration and other recent polls. Surveys from Fox News and Pew show President Trump's job approval dropping 5 to 7 points, down to 44% and 40% respectively. The Fox poll, which the president tried to discredit today, also has him underwater on virtually every major issue, including taxes, tariffs, and inflation. Meanwhile, we're seeing a familiar playbook from the White House, focusing on issues that fire up the base, particularly on border security. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt confirmed the president will hold his first rally since taking office in Michigan Tuesday to mark his 100th day. The president today also ramping his feud with higher education, calling Harvard University anti-Semitic and a threat to democracy. And later this hour, we expect the president to announce an effort to target the Democratic fundraising platform Act Blue. Joining me now with the very latest from the White House is NBC News Chief White House correspondent Peter Alexander. And with me right here on set to break down what we're seeing from our NBC News Stay Tuned poll is NBC News national political reporter Ben Camisar. Peter, I want to start with you at the White House. Of course, we did hear from President Trump today in the Oval Office. What is the very latest he's saying about tariffs and the state of the overall economy?
Well, we'll detail the situation with China in a moment, but specifically as it relates to tariffs and the impact in the economy, the White House has been witnessing some headwinds lately. Take home sales, the slowest growth of home sales since 2009. Look at the ships, cargo ships coming from China to the ports on the West Coast, L.A. and Long Beach. New figures coming out estimating that in the first full week of May next month, that they think the numbers will be down 44% over where they were the same week a year ago. The president, though, is touting some progress on the issue of tariffs so far. Obviously, he's going to have to get 90 deals done in 90 days, as the White House and the president's allies have insisted, which remains a unique challenge. But we did hear from the Treasury Secretary today speaking about South Korea, saying there was conversations with South Korea on an effort to come to some agreement about lowering tariffs that South Korea places on American products going there. So the president is insisting that the progress is being made right now. And the bottom line is that's the message that Republicans say he should be focusing on, is this idea of progress being made, and do everything in his power to avoid allowing Americans to believe there's a sense of confusion or uncertainty about exactly what the strategy here is.
You know, Peter, I'm curious, what is the White House saying about all of these polls that we are seeing? Our latest poll showing him underwater on his handling of the economy, which is his top issue, the reason why a lot of voters put him in the White House.
I think that's right. You make a good point there. Obviously, on the topic of border security, the White House is emphasizing how successful the president's been with historic lows on that issue. But obviously, on the topic of the economy, as you look on inflation, cost of living, 60% of Americans disapprove on that issue. That's from an NBC News Stay Tuned poll right now. It's not just NBC News. Fox News independently reporting close to 60% are saying they have issues with the president's handling of the economy, and specifically on tariffs right now. That's where the president has tried to put a lot of the focus. He has been talking a lot about progress being made vis-a-vis China, obviously, with a 145% tariff now slapped on Chinese goods. The president yesterday told our colleague Garrett Haake, that there are active talks taking place. They're talking actively, he said. But we heard within the same hour from the Treasury Secretary that none of those talks have started just yet. Last night, we heard from the National Economic Council head, Kevin Hassett, saying the conversations haven't begun. And China said today through its foreign ministry that it was fake news. Here's part of what the president insisted only a short time ago. Listen.
Clarify with whom the U.S. is speaking with China. They're saying it's fake news that trade talks are happening.
Well, they had a meeting this morning, so I can't tell you. It doesn't matter who they is. We may reveal it later, but they had meetings this morning, and we've been meeting with China.
So again, the president says they have been meeting with China. His advisors say those meetings have not begun in earnest yet. For their part, or for her part, Caroline Leavitt, the White House press secretary, says there will be no unilateral lowering of tariffs on China. It will only come in the form of negotiations, and in the eyes of the U.S. and the president, if China is to begin the process of backing down. Leavitt herself told us just yesterday here that Americans just need to be patient.
Yeah, and given all the volatility that we've seen in the markets, Peter, there's no doubt that all eyes are on China. Thanks so much for that breakdown. Really appreciate it. Good to see you, Ben. Let me turn to you. Let's start with our new NBC News Stay Tuned poll. Part of what we are seeing, 60% say they disapprove of President Trump's handling of inflation and the cost of living. As I was just discussing with Peter, this is his number one issue. This is one of the biggest reasons why he was elected. Ben, what are you seeing in these numbers? How significant?
I think they're very significant because ultimately you think about how Americans interact with the economy, right? It's rising prices. It's the price of eggs. It's the price of gas. It's so easy to have that be kind of the first line of defense. And to your point, one of the big arguments that Donald Trump made, then candidate Trump, made against Joe Biden was on the issue of prices, and it's a very tangible return. And so I think it's not super surprising to see these numbers because it's very clear what you're seeing in both in the broader economic sphere, but also just in what the price of goods and groceries look like when you go to the store.
Well, when you think about the price of goods, you think about how much everyone has in their pockets. And take a look at this compared to a year ago. How is your personal financial situation? That was the question we asked in our poll. 44% say about the same. 34%, Ben, say worse today. 22% say better today. What do you make of that aspect? It only reinforces these concerns about the economy. And I think the pressure on President Trump, on administration officials to, in fact, be able to strike deals.
The longer you're in office and the more you take risks with your economic strategy, certainly the president and his team argue that long term, this is going to be better for America. That remains to be seen. It could very well be true. But in the short term, if the voters aren't seeing a tangible return, they're going to, you're going to pay for it. The question is, can they land these deals? Can they land the plane in this sort of medium to long term? And ultimately this all goes away? Maybe, but in the short term, it's hurting people, right? People are hurting, and they're telling us that in the polls.
Yeah, and it's just such a fundamental issue, I think, for so many people. There's also the big picture, his overall approval rating. For that, we turn to some other polls, including the Fox News poll, which certainly got President Trump's attention. He tried to discredit this poll. 44% his job approval rating. That's down from the last time he was asked. 40% according to Pew. So underwater certainly, and down from where he was when he was inaugurated. Down, quite frankly, from where his counterparts were.
Yeah, no, I think we used to elect presidents, and it used to have this long, graceful honeymoon period. We don't really have that anymore. But I think it's kind of a double-edged sword with Trump. He has a high floor because the Republican Party is so coalesced around him that, he's going to be more sticky in these numbers. We're not going to see a dramatic drop, unless something crazy happens. But we're also, there's a ceiling to be had here because ultimately, I think the first couple months of this administration have been so geared toward a sort of the policies that really endear himself to the right flank, to the Republican Party. The question now is, can he make this pivot in the economy? Obviously, it's an issue that touches everyone. Can he make this pivot and bring more people into the fold when these early actions have been largely based on rewarding the base?
I think that is the key question. I want to also look at his marks on border security. That's another one of his biggest issue. He is getting high marks on his handling of the border. Let's take a look at those figures. You can see there, Ben, higher on border security, certainly than the economy, where it's negative 18. Border security is the one issue where he is doing well. So if you want to know why he is happy to talk about these various fights he's having with the courts over deporting people, that's why he's winning on this issue.
I like to think of what he told one of my close personal colleagues, Kristen Welker, in December, right? I won on prices. Yeah. I won on the border. That's what he told you. And I really try to look at his presidency through that lens. And this economic number, the economy used to be his strength, right? So to see it falling like this is really interesting. And what I think this poll does really well, this Fox News one that we just showed on the screen, it splits up border security and immigration. They have this story to tell on the border that has been working broadly, right? The number of apprehensions at the border have gone down. They've been able to tell that story in a way that seems to be resonating with people. But this immigration thing is harder because I spoke to a voter in Arizona just briefly. It's really stuck with me. He said that he's totally in ideological lockstep with the president, but he wonders why he's taking kind of like the hardest approach possible, the one that sort of causes the most pain and anguish and controversy. Like, there is a story to be told here for them, but they're seeking controversy. And you see that with a lot of the immigration, with the headlines in the news, what we're seeing. And ultimately, I think that that's something that is going to be a question of whether or not he can sort of expand that.
Yeah, I think you're right. And having that first-person account is just so informative. Ben, thank you so much for being here, breaking down all the numbers for us. We really appreciate it.
Joining me now with the latest from Capitol Hill is NBC News senior political reporter Sahil Kapoor. Sahil, good to see you. I know you are following every move on this, and there's a limited sort of rush. 4 weeks sounds like a lot of time. It's not. Do we have a sense yet of any readout from the president's conversation with Speaker Johnson?
Yeah, Kelly, we don't know too much. The White House has not put out a readout, but Speaker Johnson did come back to the Hill after the meeting, briefly spoke to reporters, didn't say a whole lot. He said it will be a critical few weeks coming up in the run-up to Memorial Day because his goal is to pass that massive multi-trillion-dollar piece of legislation through the House of Representatives by Memorial Day. That requires the committees in the coming days rolling out their individual pieces of the bill, passing it and sending it over to the Budget Committee, which will essentially staple it all together, send it to the floor. As you know, Kelly, Republicans have a very small House majority and a lot of work to do. Now, we also know there was a political component to this meeting in the White House with President Trump. We know that because not only did Speaker Johnson attend, but the NRCC chairman, Rich Hudson, who runs the House Republican campaign effort, was also there. And we know that right around the time they were meeting, President Trump put out endorsements of several key Republicans who are in competitive districts will be targeted by Democrats next fall, including Gabe Evans in Colorado, Juan Ciscomani in Arizona, Derek Van Orden in Wisconsin, and Scott Perry in Pennsylvania, who was sort of a surprise, almost defeated Republican last fall.
And a lot of times those campaign meetings are held off-site and not at the White House because of the sort of the line to keep official business and campaign business separate. When you consider some of the issues Republicans are dealing with right now, there's intra-party fighting among Republicans about how to make all of these cuts work, what their priorities are, and just how to get it across the finish line. What are you sensing now about that sort of family conversation among Republicans about where things stand?
It's gotten quite contentious already, Kelly. There is an enormous amount to do for Republicans still between now and the finish line. They have to iron out some of the toughest, thorniest issues. And take a look at 5 of them. We have a new piece today outlining some of the biggest things that they have to address. One is how to cut Medicaid spending. There is simply no way to make the math work for the Republican budget without significant spending cuts to Medicaid. The hardliners on the conservative side want to go big on this, whereas a number of Republicans in swing districts are very nervous about that. There's the scope of the tax cuts. Just extending the TCJA from 2017, that's the Trump tax cuts from his first term, is going to cost trillions of dollars. Are they going to add Trump's other campaign promises for his second term? No tax on tips and overtime. There's, of course, the SALT deduction. That's state and local taxes, a huge issue in high tax jurisdictions where some Republicans in places like New York and New Jersey are insisting on lifting what is currently a $10,000 cap. Many Republicans don't want to do it. And then there are also rollbacks to clean energy funding that they're wrestling with because a lot of the money goes to red districts. Finally, new Pentagon spending. Does the Pentagon need another $100 billion? Some Republicans say yes.
Well, with that list, Sahil, I know you will be busy trying to track down how it's going day by day. That is a comprehensive and complicated list. Thank you so much. We appreciate that you're on the beat.
For more on all this, I'm joined now by NBC News business and data correspondent Brian Chung, NBC News senior White House correspondent Kelly O'Donnell, NBC News correspondent Steve Patterson, who's at the Port of Los Angeles, and CNBC senior economics reporter Steve Leisman will be with us in a moment. Brian, I want to start with you. Take us under the hood of this GDP report. Was it a good or bad report for the state of the overall economy?
Yeah, and by the way, GDP stands for gross domestic product. This is the most trusted measure of how much an economy grows. And what we saw from this report earlier this morning, which again is published by the government in the form of the Commerce Department's Bureau of Economic Analysis, showed that we had a contraction of economic activity in this country, down 0.3%. That is the first negative print that we've seen on a quarter of growth in about 3 years. So again, what is kind of underneath that figure? Well, it seems like most of the drag on economic activity was due to a surge in imports. So these are companies that essentially pull forward any sort of orders, let's say for toys that could be, put on shelves later on this year. They wanted to get ahead of those tariffs, likely ahead of January 20th. That's a big reason why we saw the negative contribution to GDP, even though consumer spending on investment, as you could see on that chart ahead of you, were indeed in the positive. So it does seem like most of the economic activity, that was really in the negative side was due to the pull forward of inventory, as opposed to more kind of core parts of economic growth, like the way that consumers spend and the way that companies invest, as well as governments spend. Again, not necessarily a red flag, but of course that negative print is catching a lot of attention because if you get 2 in a row, that can, by some definitions, be what some would consider a recession game.
Brian, I want to pick up on that point of consumer spending. We've been hearing over the last several days from the administration, specifically the Treasury Secretary Bessent, that they're shrugging off these sagging poll numbers when it comes to the economy because they say the data is still looking good for them, that consumer spending is still high relatively. So how much do we know whether consumer spending may have been juiced by people moving up planned purchases on iPhone, cars, for example, to front run these tariffs?
Yeah, well, look, on the import side, which we just talked about, that's companies that are basically trying to put in as much orders as they can and try to get things stateside as early as they can to get ahead of the tariffs. But on your question about whether or not consumers are doing the same, are people choosing to buy a vehicle? Are people choosing to buy a new washing machine to get ahead of steel and aluminum tariffs or auto tariffs? It's not necessarily clear based off of the data that we're seeing right now. The data still looks, by all standards, relatively okay. By some measures, the personal consumption expenditures, which is a proxy for consumption as measured by these statistics, by GDP, were below estimates. But again, they were still positive. And there's nothing necessarily about that specific side of the GDP accounting that would suggest that we are in a recession. The consumer does account for about 70% of all economic activity. So if that were to contract, that could be trouble. But we're not seeing it yet, Gabe.
Brian Chung, thanks for walking us through that. Brian, thank you. I want to turn now to Kelly O'Donnell at the White House. Kelly, President Trump is urging patience on the economy, as we mentioned, and downplaying the potential effects of empty store shelves. So walk us through what he's saying today.
Well, one of the things that is striking is to sort of measure how the president has been adjusting this. He certainly talked about tariffs broadly during the campaign, but as you pointed out, he did not do a lot of preparing the public for what that could look like in the real world impact. And now he's doing a bit more of it. And it was striking today to hear him talking about one particular sector of the economy, and that is toy sellers. Obviously, the Christmas holiday season is, in terms of the retail landscape, not that far off. And planning will need to be done on that. And the president seemed to reflect how the toy makers have a real issue because so much of their product comes from China. Very different than automakers, which are a smaller volume, much higher price point, and so forth. For the toy makers, it is lots of pieces. They are typically lower cost, but very expensive to be sustaining that 145% China tariff. So what really stood out today in his very long cabinet meeting is where he hinted that American children might have to do with less in terms of presents under the tree or for birthdays or special occasions because there would be an impact on the cost from China. Here's a portion of what the president said.
They made $1 trillion with Biden, $1 trillion, even $1.1 trillion with Biden selling us stuff. Much of it we don't need. You know, somebody said, oh, the shelves are going to be open. Well, maybe the children will have $2 instead of $30, you know, and maybe the $2 will cost a couple of bucks more.
A couple of bucks more. Well, a 145% tariff is arguably a lot more than a couple of bucks, and that, of course, is paid by the importing companies, some of whom are talking about the fact that this is a crushing level of cost for them that they had not prepared for, but trying to sort of shift the expectations for the public. Now, little children are not probably watching the cabinet meetings, but they certainly ask their parents for the gifts and the special things that they want, and moms and dads will have to adjust to higher costs. So is a doll or a toy that goes up significantly in cost due to tariffs, is that something that families will be able to sort of absorb for those special occasions coming up? That's a real tonal shift from the president saying, effectively, be prepared to do with less.
Yeah, certainly, Kelly. That was very striking from that cabinet meeting. Kelly O'Donnell, live for us outside the White House. Kelly, thank you. Now turning now to Steve Patterson, who's outside the Port of Los Angeles. Steve, what are port officials seeing right now in terms of the imports from China?
You know, Gabe, it's really simple. 145% is simply too high for some U.S. companies. So they're altogether either pausing the amount of shipments that are coming out of China or altogether halting them, which is resulting in the numbers that we're reporting now. When we spoke to port officials about a month ago, they were estimating anywhere from 10 to 20% in a reduction of cargo. Now the estimate, as you mentioned, for next week, year over year, 35%. That number is unsustainable. It translates into the month of May, where they expect ship traffic to be down about 25%. And that bleeds into every aspect of the supply chain, the suppliers, the haulers, the truckers. All of these businesses are now affected. And the smaller they are, the first they will be hit. The first wave is always the people who can handle it the least. And that's what we're seeing as far as small businesses. That will eventually translate to mid-level retailers and some of those those big retailers. As you mentioned, though, the big retailers able to push through their goods first, upfront those goods when they realized that Trump had been elected and that these tariffs were going to take place. So they upfronted. But that sort of bubble has now burst, and we're starting to see the results of it. What they're hoping is that that doesn't translate to store shelves and then consumer spending, which would spiral the economy. Gabe.
And Steve, you mentioned the reaction there from businesses, small businesses, larger retailers. What's the reaction from officials at the port? What are their biggest concerns moving forward?
Yeah, jobs, Gabe. I mean, everything in the port, really in the larger community, especially here in San Pedro, is dependent upon the cargo that comes in. A lot of the hourly workers, including the truckers, again, the haulers, even the longshoremen that work the port, and there are 15,000 of them, 54%, living in the larger community about 5 miles in circumference from here, are worried about not having the hours needed to support and provide a livelihood for their families. So we're going to see a reduction in hours, of course, no doubt about that. The port CEOs are saying we're holding the phone on the possibility of maybe large-scale layoffs, but layoffs will be coming if there is no solution on the table for these tariffs. Because, again, 145% is just not sustainable enough, especially when half of the business done, both imports and exports for both of the ports here, these massive ports here in Southern California, 50% of them are business with China. It's just not a sustainable business model. Gabe?
Steve Patterson, live for us in California. Steve, thank you. I want to turn now to Steve Leisman from CNBC. Steve, what do policymakers take away from this GDP report? Because their biggest fears are a contracting economy and rising prices, and this report had warning signs for both.
Yeah, it did. So I think for most people right now, this one is not the one that is the one that we're worried about. That's coming next. We know we had this surge in imports ahead of the tariffs, and that ended up taking a big chunk out of GDP. We also know that we had American consumers were buying we're buying a lot of cars and things ahead of time, again, to try to beat the tariff. So this report is sort of a wash. Next report, next quarter, might have a similar amount of noise in it because you get a snapback from all the stuff that happened in the first quarter. So what people are looking for is, well, what's going to happen in the third and fourth quarter of this year? And that's where we see a pretty serious downgrade to the economy. Before President Trump took office, there was pretty good optimism. Our survey showed an expectation of 2% growth for the third and fourth quarter, or say average for the back half of the year. Now we're looking for less than 1%, kind of teetering on the negative or the zero number.
And Steve, okay, so you talked about the third and fourth quarter could be problematic. Why don't you clarify the timeline there for our viewers? Because President Trump keeps urging Americans to be patient and wait and see until these tariffs actually take effect. So when will those tariffs fully take effect, and what's going to happen when they do?
Well, I'm not a mind reader, and certainly not a mind reader of this president, so I don't know the answer to that. We have been back and forth on these tariffs. There have been days when you've had tariffs on and off on the same day. And you needed as Justin Wolfers joked one day, an intraday tariff tracker to understand where these tariffs, were they on, were they off. We just yesterday got some relief for the autos. What seems to be happening is what I call clean up in aisle 12 economic policy, is that things keep being thrown off the shelves, and then the president has to go back and ex post, or his people have to go back and clean them up. This is the opposite of the way most economic policy tends to be made, where you might say, okay, we're going to put tariffs on the auto industry. Let's talk to the automakers and find out how they might be affected by this and see if we can mitigate the worst of a policy that we're putting together. What happens in this case is they put the policy on, they realize that it's a disaster for a certain industry, then they go ahead and they somehow ameliorate or change the policy. So I don't know. Nobody knows. There's some period of time here. They're negotiating these deals. They say they're close to deals. We haven't seen any deals. There's no progress that we can see from China, which is the big one. Some of the other ones with the Europeans, we don't know how that's going to be. So this is the uncertainty that has really frozen business. They're not firing. We haven't seen that in the data yet. But also the hiring may be muted as well.
Yeah, a lot to watch over the next coming weeks and months. Steve Leisman, senior economics reporter for CNBC. Steve, we always appreciate your expertise. Thank you. Pleasure.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.